The difficulties of our psychotherapeutic work teach us to take truth, goodness, and beauty where we find them. They are not always found where we look for them. Often they are hidden in the dirt or are in the keeping of the dragon. Every one of us carries what Carl Jung described as the shadow. This shadow is made up of the parts of our personality that we push down and hide because they create feelings of shame, guilt, or fear inside us. These are the qualities, thoughts, and impulses we do not want to see in ourselves. So we repress them and keep them out of our conscious awareness. However, something that people often fail to notice about the shadow is that it does not contain only dark or negative qualities. It actually holds both positive and negative elements within it, or as Jung once wrote, what our age thinks of as the shadow and inferior part of the psyche contains more than something merely negative. Besides pushing away our weaknesses and character flaws, many of us also end up suppressing our strengths, abilities, and the greatest potential that exists inside us. In other words, we do not only hide the parts of ourselves that we think are bad or unacceptable, but we often hide the powerful and valuable parts as well. Our talents, our creativity, our confidence, and even our capacity for greatness can become buried simply because we are afraid of how they might change our lives or how others might react to them. Because of this, many people unknowingly keep their own potential locked away, just as they do with their flaws. Or as the author Ken Wilber writes, you can completely lose track of incredibly positive things about yourself. Your beauty, goodness, strength, and virtue. The so-called golden shadow. In today's video, we explore why we fear the contents of the golden shadow and why we avoid moving towards our highest potential. The impetus that makes you fly is our great human possession. Everybody has it. It is the feeling of being linked with the roots of power, but one soon becomes afraid of this feeling. That is why most people shed their wings and prefer to walk and obey the law. The 20th century psychologist Abraham Maslow believed that every human being carries a natural drive to become great and a deep inner urge to move toward what he described as our highest possibilities. In his view, people are naturally pulled toward growth, creativity, achievement, and the full development of their potential. Yet despite having this inner drive, very few of us ever come close to reaching these highest possibilities in our lives. Most people stop far before they ever reach the level they are truly capable of. According to Maslow, one of the main reasons for this is surprisingly simple. It is not only that we lack ability or opportunity, but that we are actually afraid of our own greatness. The idea of stepping fully into our potential can feel intimidating and overwhelming. True greatness often requires responsibility, courage, and major changes in how we live. Because of this, many people unconsciously hold themselves back. They avoid situations that could reveal their full abilities, and they stay inside what feels familiar and safe. In other words, we often fear becoming great more than we truly desire it. Or as he wrote, we fear our highest possibilities. We are generally afraid to become that which we can glimpse in our most perfect moments. We enjoy and even thrill to the godlike possibilities we see in ourselves. And yet we simultaneously shiver with weakness, awe, and fear before these very same possibilities. Abraham Maslow believed that the fear of reaching one's highest possibilities is so common among people that he gave this phenomenon a special name, the Jonah Complex. He took this idea from the biblical story of the prophet Jonah, who tried to run away from the destiny that God had given him. Instead of accepting his mission, Jonah attempted to escape it because the responsibility and the challenge felt overwhelming. But what exactly causes this complex inside us? In his book Art and Artist, the psychologist Otto Rank offered an explanation. Rank believed that human beings are guided by two very deep and powerful fears, the fear of death and the fear of life. According to Rank, the fear of death is not only the fear that our physical body will eventually stop existing, it is also the fear of a psychological death. This psychological death happens when a person loses their individuality by conforming too much to society. When we constantly try to fit in, follow the crowd, and avoid standing out, we slowly lose the unique qualities that make us who we are. In this sense, the fear of death pushes us in the opposite direction. It encourages us to develop our individuality and to express the abilities that make us different from others. Because of this fear, We feel a motivation to realize our unique potential and to become our own person. Rank described this drive using the original Latin meaning of the word exist. The word comes from the Latin existere, which means to step out, to stand forth, to emerge, or to appear. In other words, to truly exist means to step forward and express who we really are. However, while the fear of death pushes us toward individuality, the fear of life pulls us in the opposite direction. The fear of life is the fear of moving too far away from the safe and familiar world of conformity. It is the fear of becoming too independent, too unique, or too different from everyone else. There are real risks that come with developing your individuality. Standing out can feel lonely. It can create a sense of isolation. It can also expose a person to criticism, rejection, or exclusion from others. Society often pressures people to remain similar and predictable. As a Japanese proverb says, "The nail that sticks out gets hammered down." Because of this, the fear of life and the fear of death constantly pull us in two different directions. These two forces create a tension that shapes and molds our personality throughout our lives. As Rank wrote in Will Therapy, between these two fear possibilities, the individual is thrown back and forth all his life. In modern society, however, many people tend to fear life more than they fear the loss of their individuality. In other words, people are often more afraid of standing out than they are of slowly shrinking their personality by conforming too much. This fear of life plays a major role in creating the Jonah Complex. The more afraid we are of being different and discovering our own individuality, the less likely we are to move toward our highest possibilities. As Friedrich Nietzsche once remarked in Beyond Good and Evil, the concept of greatness entails being able to be different. Yet the fear of life is not the only thing that prevents people from reaching their highest potential. Colin Wilson, one of the most prolific authors of the 20th century, believed that modern society suffers from what he called an insignificance neurosis. According to Wilson, this widespread feeling makes people believe that their lives are small, unimportant, and lacking in meaning. Wilson observed that much of modern thinking is shaped by what he called the unheroic hypothesis. He described this idea in his book, The Age of Defeat, as a general feeling of defeat, disaster, and futility that seems to appear again and again in modern writing and philosophy. For centuries, people have asked the question, is human beings closer to a god or to a worm? According to Wilson, modern culture tends to answer this question by placing human beings much closer to the worm. For example, many interpretations of modern science describe human beings as nothing more than a temporary arrangement of physical matter that eventually turns back into dust after death. At the same time, many popular political ideologies downplay the value of the individual and portray people as nothing more than small parts in a larger social machine that exists only to serve the needs of the collective. When people fully accept these kinds of views, they begin to underestimate the potential that exists within human beings. As a result, many of our abilities, talents, and strengths remain hidden within what Jung described as our golden shadow. Interestingly, Abraham Maslow, who was a friend of Colin Wilson, came to very similar conclusions about this feeling of insignificance. Maslow often asked his students an unusual question. He would ask them who among them believed they would someday write a great novel, become a great composer, or achieve true excellence in the field they had chosen. And through these conversations, he discovered that generally everybody starts giggling, blushing, and squirming until I ask, if not you, then who else? Maslow goes on to explain that even if we get an inkling that perhaps we could accomplish something great, these thoughts are quickly thrown to the wayside. Who are we to have such grandiose thoughts, we ask ourselves, and an accounting of all our flaws will have us reject any grand aspirations. Or as Maslow writes, the person who says to himself, yes, I will be a great philosopher and I will rewrite Plato and do it better. He must sooner or later be struck dumb by his grandiosity, his arrogance, and especially in his weaker moments, will say to himself, who? Me? And think of it as a crazy fantasy or even fear it as a delusion. He compares his knowledge of his inner private self, with all its weakness, vacillation, and shortcomings, with the bright, shining, perfect, and faultless image he has of Plato. Then, of course, he'll feel presumptuous and grandiose. What he doesn't realize is that Plato, introspecting, must have felt just the same way about himself, but went ahead anyway, overriding his doubts about himself. But there is another reason that helps explain the Jonah Complex, and this reason may be the most powerful one of all. We often fear our own potential for greatness, and we also fear the inner drive that pushes us toward it. The reason for this is simple but uncomfortable. If we admit that this potential truly exists within us, then we can no longer justify living a passive, safe, and mediocre life. As long as we convince ourselves that we simply do not have the talent, the strong character, or the opportunities that successful people seem to possess, it becomes much easier to accept our failures and limitations. Telling ourselves that we are unlucky, disadvantaged, or simply not gifted enough creates a convenient explanation for why we have not achieved more. Blaming fate, bad luck, or circumstances often serves a psychological purpose. It protects our self-image and reduces the feeling of responsibility. When we believe that our situation is the result of forces outside our control, we are able to pursue comfort, safety, and an easy life without feeling too guilty about leaving our potential unused. In this way, the belief that we lack the ability to achieve greatness becomes a kind of defense mechanism. It allows us to avoid the pressure and responsibility that would come with recognizing our true abilities. Because once we truly acknowledge our potential, we also have to face the effort required to develop it. In other words, we fear our highest possibilities because they demand something difficult from us. They require effort, discipline, persistence, and courage. They require us to leave our comfort zones and take responsibility for shaping our own lives. For many people, this challenge feels overwhelming, so it is easier to ignore their potential rather than pursue it. Or as Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "They fear their higher self because when it speaks demandingly.